Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's presentation. Our presenter today is Laurie Kelly. Laurie has a 35-year career spanning the fields of accounting, finance, risk management, and regulatory compliance. Most recently, she served as Director of Compliance for CoBank ACB, a $136 billion farm credit system institution, where she developed and managed the bank's AML, fraud, and economic sanctions compliance programs. She holds CAMS designation as well as CAMS audit specialization. She also helped co-found the ACAMS Colorado chapter, serving as the executive board chair and programs director. And with that, I'd like to hand over the presentation over to Laurie.
Well, thanks, Anu. And hi, everybody. And once again, welcome to our webinar on Effective Suspicious Activity Report, or SAR, writing. Now, before we get into the topic today, let's get a little background from all of you with a poll question. So how many suspicious activity reports does your institution file on average each month? Now, if you work for somebody that doesn't file SARs, then just pick number 6, or number 5, rather. This doesn't have to be precise, just give us your best guess. So we'll give you a few moments to answer that. And this is just to give us an idea of the type of experience you're having on a day-to-day basis, the volume of SARs that you're processing, and as well the size of the institution that you work for. So we'll give people a few more minutes to answer this.
Do you have any, while we're waiting for people to answer, do you have any sort of metrics or idea of how many SARs typically are filed by institutions?
I don't know. It really depends on the size of the institution, the nature of your customer base, the type of institution as well. You know, if you're an MSB versus just a traditional depository institution versus a life insurance company versus a securities broker dealer, you know, all of those are going to have different volumes of SARs.
Okay. So it looks like Nicole has closed the poll. So about 40% of the attendees said they filed 20 or fewer.
Okay.
And then the rest is, 21 to 50 is 20%, 21 to 50. And then another 13% for 51 to 100 per year. And then more than 100 is about 15%.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. At my institution, we were in that 20 or less category, typically, depending on our fraud volume, our incidence of fraud cases. The money laundering SARs was definitely under 20, but they were all big cases. So, but let's move on. So here's what we're going to cover today. Suspicious activity reports, or SARs, really are the backbone of AML compliance, and they're what drive the ultimate purpose of an AML program, which is to report suspicious activity to law enforcement. Unfortunately, sometimes that purpose gets lost amongst all the details, all the filing regulations, the timelines, the due dates, the checkboxes, and even your own institution's procedures, your internal procedures. So my goal today is to resurrect, if you will, the true purpose of SARs by helping you see SAR writing from what might be a new and different perspective. And this is based on the proposition that when we understand who is using the information in a SAR, how these users obtain SAR reports and data, and for what reasons, we as AML professionals can then create SARs that are the most effective in achieving their ultimate purpose, which is fighting crime. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that everything I'm sharing today is from a U.S. regulatory perspective, but a lot of what I cover and talk about is relevant to everyone. So I'll start with a discussion of why SAR quality is so important, and then I'll give you some insights, again, from a U.S. perspective of who may be reading your SAR. And we'll go over a couple of money laundering cases where SARs were instrumental in ultimately prosecuting the offenders. Then we'll talk about some of the most important aspects of effective SAR writing, with an emphasis on writing for the reader. And finally, I'll talk about a tool that you may find very useful in your SAR processes. And I'll wrap up with some concluding comments, and then we'll dive right into your questions. But before we move on, one more bit of housekeeping here, and that is just be aware that my presentation today is meant to help you understand the subject matter, but I am not a lawyer, so don't take anything I say as legal advice. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, let's get started. To really underscore the importance of our topic today, here are a few pretty staggering statistics. In 2020, there were over 2.5 million SARs filed with the U.S. Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, across all types of filing institutions. Now, with an average of 261 working days in the United States in a year, that represents almost 9,600 SARs filed every business day. And that is an incredible number to me. And these 2020 totals represent an increase of over 200,000 SARs compared to 2019. Now, if you'd like to track these stats yourself, FinCEN has a great interactive query tool at the link shown here. You can generate a report for specific types of filing institutions by month, by year, by type of crime reported, and lots more filters. Now, in the U.S., we've had the capability to file SARs electronically since 2002, and it became mandatory in July of 2012. So really, this advent of e-filing has brought a wealth of financial intelligence data to law enforcement, counterterrorism, and to financial regulators as well. Now, the value of any data is only as good as its quality. The content and quality of the data in a suspicious activity report is no different. So going back to basics here, think of data as the foundation of a hierarchy. On top of data, you have information, which is data in context. And when information becomes actionable, it produces knowledge. And then when we apply that knowledge, we get wisdom. So if you have bad data quality, you won't have good information quality. And with poor information quality, you won't have the right actionable knowledge, and therefore you won't be able to apply that knowledge to get the proper outcome. So think about this as it relates to a SAR. Law enforcement needs actionable information to determine if they should pursue an investigation into suspicious activity that's being reported to them. And they rely on us to provide this information, which is based on data that we've collected. So when we understand who is using the information we provide in a SAR, how they're getting it, and for what purposes they're using it, then we can strive to provide actionable information that helps law enforcement to fight crime, which is really our ultimate purpose. Now, interestingly, this concept of usefulness to law enforcement is something that's emphasized in the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020, which took effect on January 1 of this year in the United States. Now, while all the details of this new law are beyond our scope today, it is interesting to note that it requires FinCEN to, quote, to the extent practicable, to periodically disclose to each financial institution a summary of information on SARs that proved useful to law enforcement. Not sure how they're going to do this, but ever since 2019, FinCEN's been working on something that they call the BSA Value Project, which they describe broadly as a study and analysis of the value of BSA information received. And by BSA information, we would mean SARs and CTRs, or cash transaction reports. So in order to provide comprehensive and quantitative understanding of the broad value of BSA reporting and other BSA information to make it more effective. So we have to wait for the regulations to come out to implement this act to see how this will really impact us in compliance. And that makes for a good segue to our next topic. So with 2.5 million or more SARs filed in a year, is it even remotely possible that the SAR that you filed will be read by someone? Well, surprisingly, yes. There's actually a fairly high probability that your SAR will be read by a person, either proactively after it's filed or through data mining by law enforcement. So who might read your SAR? Well, one likely possibility is a SAR review team. Now, there are over 100 of these teams located throughout the U.S., and their job is to proactively review new SARs that have been filed in the team's designated geographic area. Now, a typical SAR review team is made up of agents from IRS Criminal Investigations, or IRS CI, as we call them, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the DEA, and the U.S. Secret Service. And the team might also include members from the U.S. Attorney's Office or state or local law enforcement, or sometimes even regulatory agencies. Now, these SAR review teams meet on a periodic basis, depending upon the volume of SARs submitted. And usually one law enforcement agency is the lead for each review team, which is most commonly IRS CI. Now, the lead agency downloads the SARs to be reviewed from the FinCEN database, and then they're divided up amongst the various team members based on usually the type of underlying crime. Now, given the high volume of SARs filed and limited resources available to review them, most SAR review teams do use some targeted selection criteria to pick the reports that they'll review. It might be a dollar amount, certain types of criminal activity, specific keywords used in the narrative, which we'll talk about in a little while, and whether the report is new versus continuing activity, which we'll also talk about later, and other factors. We also have special teams called SAR review task forces. Excuse me. Now, unlike SAR review teams, whose members also have day jobs, SAR review task forces are made up of agents and officers who are devoted entirely to SAR reviews. Excuse me there. So there are about 25 SAR review task forces in place today.
It's allergy season, isn't it, Laurie?
Oh, yes.
Just take a moment to
one moment.
drink. I totally understand.
Okay. Can't guarantee that might not happen again, but
okay. Well, no worries.
We'll do our best. We'll do our best.
Yes.
Okay. So the task forces work a lot like review teams, except that they review every SAR that's submitted in their geographic area. The SARs that they review might be then selected for further investigation, either by IRS CI or another agency based on the type of underlying criminal activity.
Oh, looks like that tickle's a little pervasive. Well,
yes, sorry about that.
That's all right. That's the wonderful thing about summer. It's warm outside, but it usually comes with allergies.
Yes, it does. Okay, so one other way that your SAR might be read is through data mining of FinCEN SAR's database. So FinCEN effectively has one of the largest repositories of information available to law enforcement in the U.S. because of how they can link the SAR database to a variety of other data sources. Now, law enforcement can query the data in this repository either proactively or for specific cases that they're working on. Now, FinCEN analysts can provide a financial intelligence report on a particular subject, which is what we used to call a suspect, that includes their financial transactions, their identifiers, like a driver's license number, social security number, etc., their assets, their travel, and their criminal records. Now, through this data mining process, they can find connections between various subjects, map the money flows, and track suspicious activities. And they can also find the specific SARs filed by financial institutions that identified the suspicious activity. So, here are some statistics to emphasize just how extensively our SAR and CTR reports are used by law enforcement. More than 12,000 agents, analysts, and investigators from over 350 unique federal, state, local, and tribal agencies in the U.S. have direct access to the FinCEN database. And there are about 30,000 searches of the database per day, which represents on average about 7.4 million database queries per year. So to wrap this up, here's a quote from FinCEN Director Kenneth Blanco's remarks to the ABA's Financial Crime Enforcement Conference back in December of 2019. Now, he emphasizes just how important is the information that we're providing to help protect our country, prevent crime, and save lives. Now let's do another poll question. Were you aware of the SAR review teams and the SAR task forces that you can actually contact the one in your area? So either no, you haven't heard of them before, yes, you knew about them, but that you didn't know that you could contact them, or you actually knew both.
Now, Laura, you have experience with SAR review teams and SAR task force, don't you?
Yes. As a matter of fact, it is true that you can reach out to the agency lead for the SAR review team or SAR review task force that's in your area. And SAR review team leads that I've talked to in the past have told me that if a financial institution in their area has a hot SAR that should really be looked at, they want to know about it. And honestly, this is a common theme with all federal law enforcement agencies. They want to partner with us and they want us to tell them about significant cases. And the best way to find your SAR review team is to just contact the nearest office of the IRS Criminal Investigations.
Okay.
Since they're typically the agency that almost always is the lead for these review teams. And, you might need to talk to a couple of different people before you find them, but once you do, then just reach out and introduce yourself. And another thing to remember too is there tends to be a bit of turnover in these agencies and in the team members. So the person you identify as the lead now might not be the lead 6 months from now.
Okay. So it looks like about almost half the folks knew about these teams but didn't know how to contact them. So the information you provided is great. There was about a third of the people who did not know about these SAR teams and that you could contact them. So hopefully this will now be a resource for them going forward.
Great. Okay, let's move on. So it is important to realize that every day criminal cases are investigated and successfully prosecuted based on the SARs that we're filing. So let's go over two cases where a SAR played an essential role in helping get the bad guy. The first one is from a couple of years ago, but I love this one because it falls under this category of you just cannot make this stuff up. So we have Bruce Bagley, who at the time was a 73-year-old University of Miami professor. And he also happened to be a leading expert on organized crime and money laundering, especially in Latin America. He wrote a book about it and many different articles. He testified before Congress as an expert witness and consulted for the FBI, the DEA, and the Justice Department. Now, he was arrested in November of 2019 and charged with laundering $3 million of proceeds from bribery and embezzlement in Venezuela. Now, this all started back in November of 2017, 2 years before, when he set up a bank account under the name of a company that he'd incorporated about 10 years before, but he never did anything with. And then he started receiving wire transfers of around $200,000 apiece on a monthly basis. Now, the money came from a bank account in the United Arab Emirates, which supposedly belonged to some food company, and also an account in Switzerland under the name of a wealth management firm based in, guess where, the United Arab Emirates. In reality, the money was coming from an unnamed Colombian individual. And after Bagley would get a wire transfer, he'd withdraw about 90% of it in the form of a cashier's check. And then he'd hand that over to another Colombian individual who would take it and deposit it into his own account. And then Bagley would keep the remaining 10% for himself by wiring it to his personal account. And he created fake contracts to account for the hundreds of thousands of dollars he was making from this scheme. So court records show that his bank closed his business account in October of 2018 due to suspicious activity. But he just went and he opened another account at a different bank. So clearly there were SARs filed on the transactions that were occurring on the first account, and law enforcement took notice. In February of 2019, they set up a sting operation to see if he would accept a wire of $224,000. And he was informed that the money came from bribes and other corrupt dealings in Venezuela, but he jumped right in and said he would help launder it. And he kept $44,000 for himself. But wait, it gets even better. Apparently, Bagley and the guy who got the cashier's checks would visit the bank together to complete these transactions. And one time, while they were there, they were apparently overheard discussing the fact that the funds came from bribes and corruption in Venezuela. Now, although he initially claimed he was innocent, Bagley ultimately pled guilty to 2 counts of money laundering. Now, his sentence has been pushed back. His sentencing has been pushed back multiple times. And the last time was supposedly going to be in May of this year, but I can't find any record that it actually happened. So maybe he has not yet been sentenced. But he is facing up to 20 years in prison on each charge. So honestly, I guess he wasn't that much of an expert since he seems to have flunked Money Laundering 101, right? Now, I can also share with you that throughout my 13 years in AML compliance, I was directly contacted by law enforcement on many of my SARs, from the FBI to the DEA to Homeland Security, and even a U.S. military agency's Office of Investigations. But there is one specific example that has always stood out to me as an illustration of the power of FinCEN data. So my bank had received what we immediately identified as a fraudulent fax message, where they were attempting to impersonate one of our business customers and requesting a $22,000 wire transfer to somebody in Russia. Now, we of course never sent any money out, but we did file a SAR. And we noticed that in the header of the fax message, what you would see automatically placed there by a fax machine, there was this man's name, and this name appeared to be Eastern European. So we included this name as a subject on our SAR, and we also mentioned him in the narrative, and we filed the SAR electronically, and not even 48 hours later, an FBI agent contacted me about this SAR. It turns out that the FBI agent had been tracking and investigating this individual ever since he entered the U.S. from the Czech Republic 6 months before. Now, the agent had established an alert in the FinCEN database to immediately flag any report with this guy's name. So apparently, this guy had been running various scams involving cybercrime, counterfeit checks, and insurance fraud. And the agent told me that our SAR gave him a big break in his case. And then everyone on my team as well was so excited about how this one little SAR made such a big difference. So to provide actionable information for the ultimate purpose of fighting crime, a SAR needs to be written for its reader, which is law enforcement. So this means we have to provide the most critical information succinctly, clearly, and logically, so the reader can quickly grasp the nature of the case, how much money is involved, and who are the key players. And perhaps even more importantly, we should provide the underlying nuances of the activity that make it suspicious. I don't want to underestimate the importance of the various checkboxes and drop-downs and other data entry fields on the SAR form. The data that we put in these fields really is the foundation on which the house, if you will, is built. And it's here that we provide as much objective data as we can about the subject or subjects and the nature of the activity we're reporting. But when it comes to these checkboxes, I would recommend that you use them judiciously. Don't check every single box that the suspicious activity you're reporting might fall under. Instead, just choose the most relevant one. Again, remember who's using this data and how it's being stored and organized. The quality of the data goes down when there's too much to make good sense out of, really. And the narrative section is really the key to the entire report. It's here that we have to grab the reader's attention, and we can also describe the nuances that aren't obvious from the names, the account numbers, and other objective data on the form. We can also use keywords when they're applicable to help flag activity of significant concern to FinCEN. And more about keywords in just a couple minutes. So in order to truly write for our reader, our SAR narrative should be much more than just a reiteration of information that's already provided elsewhere in the report. Instead, the narrative should specifically highlight the nuances of the activity that aren't reflected in the numbers and the names. And most importantly, the narrative should give the reader, remember, law enforcement, a good understanding of why the activity you're reporting is suspicious and SAR-worthy. So remember, those SAR review teams and SAR review task forces are reading thousands of reports. So it's critical that you immediately capture their attention in the first sentence or two or three of your narrative. Do this by succinctly summarizing what is the activity, how you found it, and why you think it's SAR-worthy. Now, once you have their attention, then you can go into more detail. And as you craft the narrative, think about the aspects of the case that law enforcement would be interested in. In other words, things that aren't readily apparent from the data in the other form sections. So this might include detail like a person's behavior, their physical appearance, or even unusual comments or questions or requests made to a bank staff member, or even conversations about laundering bribe money from Venezuela, right? Well, all kidding aside, oftentimes behavior can be an indicator of a human trafficking or an elder abuse situation. So it's important that your tellers understand what things to look for, especially in those situations. Now, transaction activity frequently is considered suspicious when it's out of pattern for a customer, based on the type of business, historical account activity, and so forth. In these cases, you'll want to talk about why the activity is so unusual for that customer. Now, one example might be, say, a local retail business customer with no history of wire transfers or other foreign transactions who suddenly begins receiving wires from senders and banks in South America or Eastern Europe. Now, law enforcement also appreciates when you can describe anything odd or unusual about the transactions themselves, especially with wire transfers. For instance, wires for round amounts of $25,000 to $50,000 are one, because these amounts seem to be thought by criminals to fly under the radar of banks' monitoring systems, and perhaps they do. Also, odd, unusual, or inappropriate verbiage in a wire transfer's free-form text fields is something else to report. And I tell a story about this particular case a lot in my webinars because it's just so fascinating. At one time, I had a suspicious incoming wire transfer to a business customer for $50,000 even, where the freeform text said, quote, "For Sony home theater system, model number something, something, something." So we actually looked up the model number and found it was a real Sony home theater system that was only sold in the United Kingdom. And it retailed for about $1,200 US. But what really topped it off, though, is that this wire was sent to a produce grower from what we identified as a shell company in the UK, but the wire originated from a bank in Latvia. I mean, honestly, you do not get much more suspicious than that. Also, if you do ask your customer for an explanation of the activity, be sure to include their response in the narrative as well, along with the name of the person who said it. And one last comment in this list of do's for SAR narratives is please use concise and simple language in an active tense to cut down on the word count. Again, remember your reader and how many SARs they have to read every day. Now, since we have a list of do's, we should, of course, have a list of don'ts. So here are the big ones. Don't repeat information in the narrative that's already in another part of the form, unless it's especially relevant to telling the story. For example, you don't need to repeat your financial institution's name or location or total assets or anything like that. Same goes with the subject's account numbers, addresses, telephone numbers, and so forth. Again, unless it is relevant to telling the story. Don't include a lengthy list of transactions and all their nitty-gritty details. Now, this was something that regulators often demanded before the advent of the SAR attachment feature, which we'll talk about in a few minutes as well. So some of us more well-seasoned compliance folks may still think that this type of information is required in the narrative. But even before the attachment feature came about, I had many law enforcement agents tell me that they absolutely hated it when SAR narratives had this kind of detail because it just added no value to them and it took up a lot of space. So something else to avoid in your narratives, in contrast to our do's, is avoiding excessively verbose, passive tense language. Now, some people feel like this sounds more professional or formal, but it's really of no help to anyone. So, for example, instead of saying, a wire transfer in the amount of $50,000, just say a $50,000 wire transfer. Or instead of a wire transfer for the benefit of customer X, just say a wire transfer to customer X. So you get the idea. But on the other hand, you don't want to provide too little information. Make sure your reader has enough detail to clearly understand what happened, who did it, how much, and why this is suspicious. So in other words, don't be like Dilbert's boss. To really bring home these concepts, let's look at a SAR narrative example. So here's an example of a SAR narrative that is very, very poorly written. Now, this example actually came from a FinCEN publication from a number of years ago, where they talked about writing effective SAR narratives. And as I read it to you, think about everything you see wrong with this write-up, and then we'll have a little bit of fun picking it apart. So, First Federal Bank is filing this SAR in connection with possible suspicious payments to ABC Corporation originating from XYZ LLC. This review of the transactions that led to the filing of this SAR was prompted by an alert from the bank's payment monitoring system for Century Bank concerning transfers on behalf of its client, XYZ LLC. Century Bank is a correspondent banking client of First Federal. First Federal records reveal that from June 29, 2019 to August 1, 2019, 4 payments totaling $13,675.21 were transmitted to ABC Corporation at Century Bank. ABC Corporation is being used to repatriate funds to Venezuela. As of March 2, 2019, ABC Corporation does not appear on FinCEN's MSB registration list. Okay, who? What? I have read this probably 50 times now, and I think I am just now starting to figure out what they're trying to say. But let's look at some of the more glaring issues. First sentence, First Federal Bank is filing this SAR. No kidding. We had no idea except for that first part of the form where the bank's name goes. And then they say, in connection with possible suspicious payments. Okay, are they suspicious or not? Well, no, they're just possibly suspicious. We're not really sure yet. I sometimes wonder if their lawyers made them use that word possibly, kind of like allegedly, when you're talking about a crime, except being suspicious is not a crime as far as I know. Then they go on to say, this review of the transactions that led to the filing of this SAR was prompted by an alert from the bank's payment monitoring system for Century Bank concerning transfers on behalf of its client XYZ LLC. So, wow, you've got a payment monitoring system that generates alerts. That is really cool. But wait, it only works for Century Bank? Who's Century Bank? Oh, in the next sentence, they tell us Century Bank is a corresponding banking client of theirs. Okay. And then they go on to describe in minute detail the payments involved, and they keep mentioning this ABC Corporation, but who's that? Are they First Federal's clients? Or no, wait, they say ABC Corporation has an account at Century Bank. But I thought XYZ was Century Bank's customer. Anyway, then at the very end, they drop this bombshell that ABC Corporation is being used to repatriate funds to Venezuela. What? I mean, how the heck do they know that? And where's the word allegedly? It's a pretty serious accusation. And then they wrap it up with this tidbit about ABC Corporation not being a registered MSB. So what? Anyway, well, FinCEN did not publish a better version of this awful narrative, so I decided I would rewrite it myself. And I had to use my imagination a little bit to fill in the blanks. So I drew upon some of my real-life SARs to put together this improved version. Customer XYZ LLC, a local dry cleaner and laundry establishment, sent 4 outgoing wire transfers totaling $13,675.21 within a 4-week period to an account at Banco de Venezuela, Caracas office to beneficiary ABC Corporation, an apparent Panama-based shell company. These payments are highly out of pattern for XYZ, which has never sent or received a single wire transfer in its 8-year history with the bank. XYZ is a cash-intensive business and a high-risk customer for whom the bank closely monitors all transaction activity. ABC Corporation appears on Panama's National Companies Registry with a physical address matching that of a law firm in Panama City used by hundreds of other legal entities, per the bank's internet research. Mr. Roberto Alvarez, owner and sole member of XYZ, has stated to bank personnel that the payments were for purchases of cleaning supplies. The payments did not include any explanatory messages such as invoice numbers or other references as to purpose. Complete transaction details are provided in the attachment to the SAR. Supporting documentation is available upon request. So you can see how I've summarized the whole gist of the case in the first 3 sentences. It should be clear that these payments to Venezuela are way out of pattern for a local dry cleaner, and that the receiver looks to be a Panama shell company. And in the second paragraph, I give some additional details that aren't reflected anyplace else. I describe how I determined that ABC Corporation is quite likely a Panama shell company. I also throw in what the customer, the owner of the business, told us in explanation for these payments, and then I kind of succinctly expand on why that explanation seems a bit lame. And in the final paragraph, I remind law enforcement that there's an attachment to this SAR where they can get all the details of the transactions. And I tell them I'm more than happy to give them all my supporting documentation if they want to ask for it. Much better, yes? Now I'd like to speak briefly about 2 items related to the narrative, the attachment feature and using keywords. First, let's talk about keywords. Now, technically, these are called advisory key terms because they stem from FinCEN advisories relating to specific types of illegal activities. Now, these key terms are specific words that FinCEN wants us to include in SAR narratives when the report involves activity that's related to a FinCEN advisory. So, for example, the very first key term that FinCEN ever came up with was foreign corruption, and it stemmed from an April 2008 FinCEN advisory titled Proceeds of Foreign Corruption. And since then, 31 additional advisories and other FinCEN publications have requested the use of specific keywords, such as TBML, which stands for trade-based money laundering, funnel account, or advisory human trafficking. And this is a list of all of them right now, and I've noted some of the more frequently used ones in red. Now, a lot of these are a bit cryptic, so you'll want to visit FinCEN's website page for a complete list of all the keywords, and they also have hyperlinks to their related advisories. And you'll also notice that some of the more recent ones include the actual reference to the advisory itself, which starts with the letters FIN. And we have some related to COVID, advisory real estate, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and others that are relevant to current times. Now, it's important to be aware of these keywords and use them in your narratives whenever they apply. These keywords help SAR readers and database queries to quickly identify reports on high-priority illegal activities. In April of 2013, FinCEN released an updated version of the electronic SAR form, and one of the many enhancements was this attachment feature. It lets us attach a single CSV, or comma-separated value, file to a SAR to document transactions or other details that are too numerous to include in the narrative. for example, every field on a series of wire transfers, or say a detailed list of counterfeit checks with the dates, the payee names, the amounts, and so forth. The beauty of the attachment is that we can include extensive details without adding excess length to the narrative itself. Now, it is important to mention in your narrative that there is an attachment to the SAR. Now, while this isn't stated in any FinCEN guidance, I've been told that the attachment isn't something obvious to SAR readers, meaning they have to go looking for it. So when we tell them there's an attachment, then they don't have to waste time guessing or going looking for one that's not there. And although it may seem obvious, I do want to emphasize that the attachment is not meant to be a substitute for the narrative itself. You still have to write that. And also, by the way, the same SAR confidentiality rules apply to the attachment as they do for the entire report. Now, I'd like to take a moment to talk about another topic that I believe is important to a SAR's effectiveness, and that is the designation of the report as either new or continuing activity. So this is a checkbox on the first page of the electronic SAR form. And as you can see here, so checking new means it's reporting new suspicious activity that's never been reported. And a continuing activity report indicates that this is about ongoing activity by the same subjects of the same nature based on an original new SAR. FinCEN has given us some guidance on when to file these continuing activity SARs. So once we file an original or new SAR, FinCEN tells us to keep monitoring for any repeat activity over the next 90 days. If nothing happens in that 90-day period, we can close the case. But if there are more suspicious transactions, we should then file a continuing activity SAR to report any new transactions occurring in that subsequent 90-day monitoring period. And they give us an extra 30 days to prepare and file the continuing activity SAR. So effectively, it needs to be filed within 120 days of the date of the last SAR. And this process keeps going as long as there's more activity. So, lather, rinse, repeat. Now, clearly, law enforcement would want to know when suspicious activity is ongoing because it shows a pattern of illegal activity that could expand a criminal case beyond that of just a one-time occurrence. In fact, FinCEN even encourages us to file a continuing activity SAR before the end of the 90-day monitoring period if it involves high-priority illegal activity, like terrorist financing or large-scale human trafficking. But what happens when the activity reoccurs, but it's after the 90-day monitoring period ends? So for example, say you have a U.S. customer who receives a series of suspicious wire transfers from a bank in the Cayman Islands over a 3-day period, and then they immediately turn around and wire the funds in bulk to somebody else in another country. And the transactions are very out of pattern for the customer. So you file a SAR and you monitor the customer's accounts for more of the same type of transactions. And then 90 days go by and there's no further activity. But then on the 112th day, since the last suspicious transaction took place, the customer receives another similar series of foreign wires and does the same thing with the money again. So should the next SAR you file be new or continuing activity? Well, unfortunately, FinCEN has no specific guidance on this issue. Now, I had a number of ongoing cases with multiple continuing activity SAR filings, some of which where the repeat activity happened several weeks to months after the most recent 90-day window had closed. So I even phoned FinCEN on 2 different occasions with 2 different cases where the new activity had occurred just a few weeks outside of the 90-day window. And not surprisingly, I got 2 different answers. One FinCEN rep said, well, you should call it new. And another one said, well, you should call it continuing activity. Now, both people said there wasn't any specific written guidance that I could refer to. Now, in my experience, examiners like a literal approach to this, meaning the next SAR should be new if that 90-day monitoring period has passed. But I frequently challenged this approach. If the purpose of the SAR is for law enforcement's use, would it not be more appropriate to denote a SAR as continuing activity, because that is in fact what's really happening? I chose to ignore the 90-day rule in favor of giving law enforcement the most meaningful information possible. In other words, calling it continuing activity because that is exactly what it was. The same people, the same behavior, same everything. So clearly FinCEN has not addressed this issue, but my recommendation to you, if you encounter this dilemma, is to make your own decision. But just always remember the ultimate purpose of the SAR and just be prepared to support your position, perhaps through a case report, which is what we're going to talk about next. So, as I've been saying, the SAR and its narrative section are meant to capture the highlights of a suspicious activity case, so law enforcement readers can make informed judgments on whether to pursue an investigation. The SAR also provides key information that facilitates FinCEN database research, meaning law enforcement may find your SAR at some later date. Now, typically, a SAR narrative concludes with a statement that additional details are available upon request. And this is because a suspicious activity case is so much more than just checkboxes, keywords, and a summary. So what would you provide to law enforcement should they come asking for these additional details about a SAR? So to answer that question, I'd like to share with you a tool that I used quite successfully for this purpose and for some other purposes as well. And we called this a case report. I developed this for my team to support our complex SAR cases. So what it is a comprehensive report that provides all the details of a suspicious activity case and its related SAR filings all in one place. We set up a standard format for case reports for money laundering and another one for fraud cases. And we found this tool to have a number of benefits. First and foremost, it allowed us to quickly and efficiently deliver on law enforcement requests for a SAR's full case details. It also provided a comprehensive and detailed written report about the SAR case that can help your management, an internal SAR review committee, if you have one, your examiners or internal audit understand the nuances of the case. In other words, it removes this anecdotal aspect of explaining a SAR to those outside of compliance. And it's especially useful in continuing activity cases where you've got lots of details, multiple SARs filed, and potentially multiple law enforcement inquiries involved. Now, this was also a big benefit for my team because we could easily transfer a case between associates. Basically, anybody could pick up the case and be able to work on it. Another benefit is that you can design a case report format to meet your own institution's unique needs. And it can start as a template and then be modified as needed for any unique case elements. Finally, it was a huge productivity enhancer in terms of making the SAR preparation, cross-checking, and review process more efficient. So our process was that the associate who's developing the case, usually based on an alert or alerts from our AML monitoring system, would create the initial case report with all the known details and nuances. And they'd start with a report template and then modify it as needed to illustrate the specific nuances of the suspicious activity. And one section of the report is a draft of the actual SAR narrative. So once the report was ready, it would be routed to a supervisor for review and then to management for final approval to file the SAR. And if necessary, any of the reviewers could edit the SAR narrative right there in the report. They could add little comment boxes, or we use Word for this, so you could track changes and see exactly who was doing what edits. And then after all the approvals were documented, the case report would be routed back to the associate to create the SAR form in our AML system, where they would simply copy and paste the final approved narrative from the case report into the SAR form record. Now, it is very important to keep these case reports confidential. In other words, restrict access to them just like you would a SAR form. And that would, of course, include both the paper copies and electronic versions. Now, in the next few slides, I'm going to expand on the various sections that you may include in a case report and hopefully get you thinking about what you might like to include in your own version. So the first section in our format was just a basic reference information section about the customer and the case itself. So the date it was opened, dates of alerts, case number, and even a category of suspicious activity are all helpful pieces of information to summarize here. Then in section 2, we captured all the detailed background information in narrative form. So things like how the activity was detected. Was it from an automated alert, a verbal report from a teller, or a fraudulent fax even? Also, you describe here what types of follow-up or investigation activities were performed and by whom. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, here's where you'd provide as much detail as possible as to why this case is SAR-worthy. If the customer or another party involved has been the subject of other SARs, you'd want to cross-reference them here as well. Section 3 is where we captured a detailed transaction history. Especially when you have wire transfers or other electronic transfers involved, it's good to have a complete list of the originator and beneficiary names, addresses, account numbers, as well as the names and locations of all the banks involved and their identification numbers, and then any verbiage in the freeform text fields. Now, if this gets too lengthy, you could always track it in a spreadsheet file and then embed that file into the case report itself, which we did on a number of occasions on our lengthy continuing activity cases. Now, section 4 we used as a law enforcement communications log. So you'll want to track the date, the name, title, contact details, and method of contact for every communication you have with law enforcement regarding the case. And you do have to include your initial law enforcement contact on the SAR itself. So this is helpful for that. And section 5 is the SAR filing log. Now, this we included in a case report to provide a tracking record to document clearly that all the regulatory deadlines were met. And this is particularly important in continuing activity cases. So for each SAR filed on the case, we recorded the date the activity was detected, the date the decision to file the SAR was made, because that's when the clock starts, the date the SAR was filed, the next continuing activity SAR due date, which, as you may remember, is 120 days from the date of the last SAR, as well as the start and end date of each 90-day monitoring period. Now, you might also want to record each SAR's unique BSA ID number for quick reference as well. Now, of course, most of these details are stored in your AML system, but we found that having them here just makes it easier to check and review. And law enforcement really appreciated having those BSA ID numbers as well, so they didn't have to go searching for them. And finally, section 6 is the SAR narrative. And as I mentioned before, I always found it was much easier to draft a SAR narrative outside of the form itself or any form generating software. And really, the case report provides the perfect place to do this because all the details are right there in front of you. And when you include the proposed narrative verbatim in the case report, others who are reviewing or approving the SAR can read and edit the narrative along with the supporting information readily accessible to them. So these have been the basic case report sections that I've found to be most helpful. But again, you can certainly design this report format in whatever way works best for you and your processes. For example, if your institution has an internal SAR review committee that approves your SAR filings, you could add an approvals log section to record the date the SAR was submitted to the committee for review and the date it was approved. So at this point, you might be wondering, well, why should you take the time and effort to create a standalone case report document when you have an automated suspicious activity monitoring and SAR case management system already in place? Well, the answer to that question depends on the automated system's level of detail and accessibility of SAR case data. In all likelihood, you have a robust automated transaction monitoring system. But from a logistical and a process perspective, the case report can provide significant added value when your automated system, for example, has limited capability to store or edit freeform text notes, or you can't print a full report of the notes entered. If the system doesn't retain the SAR narrative as a separate field, in other words, you have to open the SAR form and scroll down to be able to read the narrative. If your system can't produce a summary report with content like that of a case report, that could be provided to law enforcement, internal management, or examiners or auditors. Or if it can't maintain specific records of law enforcement communications. For instance, if it may only be able to record these in textual case notes. So I'll close out this topic by saying that these case reports were extremely valuable to my bank for all the reasons I've mentioned. And when we provided these reports to law enforcement, agents were always extremely complimentary of how thorough these reports were and how they really helped them to understand the case. And the same was true for our examiners and our auditors. Without these case reports, we would have to have given them access to the AML system and then teach them how to navigate it and get the data that they needed on the SAR cases that they wanted to review. So we definitely felt that the extra effort we put into these reports was well worth it in the long run. So wrapping up here, I'd like to remind you all again that when we set out to write a SAR, we always need to keep in mind the why. And that is, SARs are the ultimate reason for an AML program. Their primary purpose is to deliver information to law enforcement promptly, concisely, and meaningfully so that potential crimes can be detected, investigated, and prosecuted. So with that in mind, here are the key takeaways from what we've talked about today. Your SAR will very likely be read. So write for your reader, which is law enforcement. Be sure to describe the nuances of the activity that aren't reflected in the checkboxes and the fill-in fields. And make sure your narrative is clear, concise, and logical. Become familiar with FinCEN's keywords and use them whenever they're appropriate in your narratives. Use the attachment feature whenever you have multiple transactions, and be sure to refer to the attachment in your narrative so the reader knows it's there. Distinguish new versus continuing activity reports as it makes most sense to you. And finally, consider using a case report tool to provide comprehensive supporting documentation to law enforcement and to your internal readers. Now, I'll close out with a quote from Jamal Al-Hindi, the just recently retired Deputy Director of FinCEN. And this was from his remarks at the February 2020 Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association Conference on AML and Financial Crime. He emphasizes how important our work is and how what we do every day enables law enforcement to identify and take action against terrorists, drug lords, kleptocrats, human traffickers, and fraudsters that are targeting our elderly and abusing our healthcare system. Honestly, I can't emphasize to you strongly enough how your work really does save lives. And that is truly the why of effective SAR writing. So thanks you again so much for your time today. I apologize for the issues with my voice, but I hope what I've shared has been helpful and thought-provoking to you.